right? So thanks, Adam, for joining. Today we are talking about Hodinkee.
Of course.
Hodinkee.
Yeah, it should be interesting.
So,
I remember, we started talking about it in a group chat, I guess, like a week or two ago, right? And then figured it might be a good discussion talking point, and we can kind of stray away and talk, about Hodinkee and just like blogging or blogs and websites in general, right? So
yeah,
I'm up for it.
let's see where it goes. So I think
Yeah.
the good start might be Hodinkee did this talking watches madness,
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
and the last podcast that they did on that topic, at the very end of the podcast, Ben Clymer says this. So I have a quote.
Mm-hmm.
So first he talks how great those Talking Watches episodes are, and they are.
Yep.
They're amazing. He
Absolutely.
says that they're awesome. The content is awesome, and he says, I wish we could do more of this without deviating to products that pay our salaries.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh my God, did he say that?
I actually, it's really funny how like candid Ben is on the podcast. When he is a guest, he's always he talks shit about Hodinkee. Really, a lot of times he's like, I can't remember. There was one podcast. I wish I could remember which one it was, but he basically was talking about pre-Hodinkee, pre-sellout, like when he sold out, right? So it's kind of funny how he talks about that, but I mean, he understands it, right? So he's a businessman too, and he gets it, and that's some of the talking points that we can get into. But I thought it was interesting too. I think in that same podcast he said there are some brands that have reached out to Hodinkee and they say, oh, let's get this celebrity on, right?
Yep.
And he said that that's something they say no to, because they still want genuine enthusiasm for watches and like true watch enthusiasts. Whereas if they have a Bradley Cooper coming on talking about his IWC Big Pilot, he's not going to have an idea. He's not going to have a clue. Or maybe like a David Beckham talking about Tudor or something. But I think
which he doesn't even wear.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I think there is sort of still some integrity there left, with Hodinkee. Obviously, we're probably going to talk about how they sort of lost their way a little bit, but there is a little bit thankfully, that left, with what Ben said on the most recent podcast, which is nice to hear,
So also, like, I don't want this to be like super, like, we're gonna talk about negative things, right? But like to be honest, like Hodinkee produces like one of the best content, right?
Oh, 100%.
If you talk about videos or you talk about articles, this is great.
No doubt.
But that great content is like, you need to find it, right?
Yes,
so now
100%.
It's all spammed with all these articles and stuff which pay our salaries.
Yeah. And I was thinking about this. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, that's the American dream. Ben is living the American dream. He created this brand from scratch, and now he's probably getting paid millions of dollars. He's driving his vintage Porsches. Like, that's awesome for him, right? And it just sucks because there's that fine line of trying to tread on, do we pay the bills, grow the company, or do we stay super small and not get paid as much, for more objective opinions, which they still do, which is great. But like, I don't knock them for growing the way they have and sort of quote unquote spamming Hodinkee every once in a while. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
So yeah. So it's like this kind of reminds me. And again, I wasn't collecting watches at that time. I see Jimmy joined us. I'm sure Jimmy probably remembers this time. So before internet, before internet went big, right? There were these magazines. So like, if you wanted to learn something about watches, you were buying these magazines about watches. And like, you open that magazine, and pretty much every single article on that magazine, it doesn't say sponsored or anything, but it's pretty much, it's like
pretty much is. Yeah. Right.
So like, when internet happened, the like forums happened, all these blogs, stuff, YouTube channels, right? So like that didn't happen, and the content was sincere. So I like for example, Tock, right? You like something, you make an episode about this. Like nobody paid you to make an episode about this Grand Seiko that you're
Right.
making, but this is great watch. So you made an episode about this, right?
Right.
So that used to be, and now it seems like at least like all these like biggest companies, they're getting polluted with all these weird partnerships, relationships, and
Well, the watch brands are finally catching on, right? Whereas in the past, the brands would be like, oh, like screw that. Finally, some of the pricier brands, like some of the early, adopters of like social media and sort of paid posts, I feel like are like Tudor. Oris has had like a partnership sort of with Hodinkee and stuff. And I think it's just that a lot of these other bigger brands are starting to do the same as well. And that's why sort of this waterfall has come onto Hodinkee over the last, I don't know, maybe 2-3 years, where there's been a much more, it was a gradual shift, and then it's been sort of a more drastic shift, probably actually even just the last year, 18 months or so,
Yeah, I agree. And this again, this is not just Hodinkee. Like you take,
sure,
like anything else which is popular, like I don't know, like Warren Wound or
Warren Wound's a good example,
yeah.
right? Because they're basically the micro brand and like more affordable budget watches version of Hodinkee, essentially.
Yep.
They're doing all these special editions and everything, which I think is great. Like that's one of the great contributions that I think Hodinkee has had is they were the first people to really get a hold of expensive watch brands, right? Or like prestigious watch brands, and make a special watch catered towards the watch enthusiast, right? So like the Hoyer Skipper, for example, that came out, that was several years ago, right?
That's probably the best one, yeah.
I love the IWC that they did, that black, the PBD, or maybe it's Ceratanium IWC. I mean, way back, they made remember the Hodinkee Vacheron Constantin, the Corne de Vache, the limit.
Yep.
I mean, that was years ago,
nice.
right?
Yep.
And the fact that they were able to get a brand from the Holy Trinity to collaborate with a website, like that's pretty impressive, right? So there have been a lot of cool contributions that have happened that have sort of cascaded towards other brands, and other brands are sort of realizing this and doing things. And now brands are doing stuff with Revolution, right? Revolution watches, Worn and Wound, like we talked about. So there are some positives, I think, and I think that the blogs like Hodinkee and stuff have had a positive impact on the type of watches that some of the big brands are making that are catered a little bit more towards enthusiasts, because these brands realize how big of an enthusiast base there actually is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
and like for example, some trends towards like smaller watches. That's also coming from Hodinkee, and that's great, right? But like staying on the same topic in terms of trends. So like what I see, and it's just like it's happening with Hodinkee just because they are the biggest company, the biggest influencer, right?
Sure.
So they are, unfortunately, they are more like a market followers, not like market leader. So let me say what.
Are you saying Hodinkee?
Hodinkee, yes. Hodinkee.
Oh, okay.
So for example, like everybody likes steel sports watches, right?
Sure.
Hodinkee writes about steel sports watches, right? Everybody likes Rolex. Hodinkee writes about Rolex, right? And so on. And because they have so many people who are reading their stuff, who are consuming their stuff, like that kind of reinforces the trends, right? So now maybe everybody liked Rolex, but you could like wait like a year and buy it from your AD. Now because Hodinkee wrote about it, now there is no hope for you to buy to buy like steel sports Rolex.
Sure. Well, so you're saying Hodinkee's followers are the ones that are easily influenced, or are you saying that Hodinkee?
I mean, yeah. So for example, so like sometime in the past, for example, they were big advocates of Universal Genève,
Yep, of
right?
course.
And they pretty much like created like created the collectability and interest in the brand.
Right.
So now they are not doing that. They are more, and that would be cool. So for example, if Hodinkee would start writing about the Accutrons, right? The like Accutrons are cool watches.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? Nobody cares about them. Nobody like gives a damn, and like that would more kind of diversify people's interests, and people would discover these very cool watches that are not Rolexes, right? But now, and if trends change, Hodinkee would change. So
you're right. Hoyer's an example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't see any coverage on Hoyer, but Hoyer was hot as hell. What, 4 years ago, maybe, right? And then that market just kind of crashed. I mean, it came back down, and you don't really see anything about Hoyer anymore on Hodinkee, right? So I definitely see that where they sort of can cater a little bit to some of those tastes of kind of what's hot already. But you're 100% right. I mean, even like look at some of the 60s Grand Seikos, right? Like imagine if Jack Forster just wrote an exceptional article on those, right?
And he doesn't.
Right, exactly. Right, so that would be, and they're very deserved of an article, you know, by Jack Forster, and it would be interesting to see what would happen to those, or what would happen to that market if it was like pushed a little bit. All you need is maybe like an article, and then like maybe a vintage spotlight on their little Hodinkee, you know, bring a loop section or something like that. So they definitely do have an impact, and I think there definitely are people who sort of follow, but at the same time, it's people follow because people see Hodinkee as sort of an authority on watches, right? So if Hodinkee says something about a certain watch, then people are going to say, oh my God, like this is amazing. Like, you know, this editor wrote all this, you know, so eloquently put, you know, described all the specs and all this, and talked about how incredible they were. Like the Grand Seiko, for example, they would talk about the time trials versus the Swiss and how they were better, blah, 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 blah. And it would probably become a hit, right? But you're right. And now, but they don't do that anymore, really. Right. It's funny. Every once in a while I'll do a Google search on usually something a little bit more obscure, like a vintage Patek or something like that, or like a vintage Patek chronograph, or like some obscure Longa that was made like 10 years ago. And I'll Google something and I'll see an article from Hodinkee that was posted in like 2012. And I'm like, yes, because I know it's going to be like an incredible article. And especially like Ben is pretty hands off on the website at this, or, you know, in terms of posting articles. But a lot of Ben's older articles from like 2011, 12, 13 are exceptional. And he does such a deep dive, and he gives a lot of his own personal opinions, which they don't do anymore, right? They try and be, you know, they're objective, but they're like too, they don't give any opinion, sort of. They just say, like, give the specs and sort of talk about it and talk about some of the history and something. But it's fun.
They say good things, right? But
exactly.
They are very, very afraid to do any criticism.
If they knock it, it's a criticism that like that's not that big of a deal. You know what I mean? Like they'll say like, oh, some people might dislike this, but I like this or something, you know? They're not very critical for sure. But it's funny though, like, cause we were talking about Ben on the podcast, right? Anytime I hear Ben speak on the podcast, it's like, he's I mean, there's nothing holding him back, right? He's completely honest about a lot of things. And I love getting some of those gems from him when he talks about some of like vintage Pateks or something, or talking about the finishing on the last podcast of like Laurent Ferrier on their Gyro Tourbillon compared to, you know, like comparing it to like 50s perpetual calendar chronographs from Patek. It would be nice to get a little bit more of that back into the website and the articles that pop up, not just these little sound bites that pop up, you know? But I've been thinking about that for a while. It's funny when I do stumble across some articles from like 2012, 13, when I was introduced to Hodinkee, right? Like I found Hodinkee probably 2011, 2012. And I was on it like all day, every day when I just graduated college in like 2013. And I mean, I learned so much. And unfortunately, like you said, Hodinkee is one example, but there's a lot of other brands that, you know, the articles are, they're paid sponsorships or whatever. So they're just not as critical or as in depth,
It's
right?
like everybody who's more or less big. So it seems like that's that business model that everybody copies from each, and they copy it
Everybody wants
from,
money,
yeah,
right? Like,
yeah. But there should be a way to do money differently, you know. But
yeah, but I guess you can make money being very objective and saying whatever you want, but you make way more money when you start partnering up, right? Because I'm sure, like, if there was a critical review of something, of some Richemont watch on Hodinkee, Ben would, or somebody at Hodinkee would get a text from some
yeah,
executive
yeah, yeah,
leadership at
and they
Richemont and be
do.
like, "What's
Yep.
what's going on here? Like,
Yeah, yeah,
why are you guys shitting on our watches?" You know what I mean?
yeah.
So, it's kind of a fine line.
Mm,
Scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, sort of thing. You
yeah.
know?
Even you talked about these cool collaborations like Vacheron collaboration,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's not like
fantastic.
Ben called Vacheron and say, "Hey, let's do watch," and they agreed, right? So like there was a lot of like steps going to that. And imagine sometime like maybe a year before, 6 months before, somebody at Hodinkee writes a negative article about one of Vacheron's watches, right?
Yeah,
Like that would kill it.
yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah. But on
but
the flip
yeah.
side,
Mhm.
too, think about it. Uh, Collaboration wise, I don't think I had ever heard of or seen a Gronfeld watch on social media or any articles until they did that collaboration with them, I think 2 years ago.
Mhm.
And that's a brand right there, the Gronfeld Bros, that are very deserved of being right at the top, you know, of hot horology with a lot of the other brands out there. And Hodinkee put them on the map, right? And I think that's a great thing that they did because, like I said, Grunfeld is very deserved of sort of the praise and everything that they get. So, you know, even in an era of this sort of like selling out, quote unquote, they still produce some great content and do some great
And
collaborations
they do,
and
yes.
bring
Mhm.
deserved brands on the map, right?
Yeah.
And of course, the prices on the Grunfelds are astronomical
Yeah.
now, right, and everything. But um,
Yeah.
uh, yeah, it's tough. I mean, I don't know. You know, they have a business to run, right? So
But there should be a way to do this business. Anyway, I don't. Yeah, nobody figures it out. So that's, yeah. So everybody pretty much does what happened with these magazines and stuff. So you actually started reading Hodinkee way before I started reading it.
oh
So
yeah, I mean,
do you remember in old times, was it mostly vintage or they were doing as much
it
modern
was
content as
it
now?
was both because I honestly still remember the day that they dropped the talking watches with John Mayer, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I vividly remember. I was
Really?
like,
Wow.
holy crap, yeah! It was like it was insane because I had been reading. You know, I think I'm on Hodinkee right now. Like I still remember when they dropped articles like Jack did stuff on like the SKX, right, and talking about
That one was
how it's a
so
hidden
good.
gem.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And they actually just did a rewind of it, and that was 2015, right? So that
Mm-hmm.
wasn't that long ago. But no, I remember it was still always a little bit of both. But what's funny is that when I first started reading Hodinkee, that's why I love going back and reading some of the old articles. When I had a very baseline level of knowledge of watches, right? So I was like, ooh, SKX, I'm going to click on this article. And there are some really nitty gritty vintage or like auction articles or hot horology articles that I couldn't fully appreciate because
Mm-hmm.
I was still just laying the framework of my appreciation of watches, right? So I would
Mm-hmm.
see like a Rolex article, and sometimes I would skip some of those articles on like the vintage watches and all that. But I think back then, from what I remember, it was a really nice mix of vintage, expensive, cheaper
Mm-hmm.
watches. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like they even had uh, they don't do this really anymore, but they used to do the value proposition.
Mm-hmm.
They used to do that all the time, I remember. And then they kind of stopped doing that as much.
Yeah.
And like that was something that I really looked forward to, right? So
Yeah.
that's an
I, I
example of
I think
something.
last one they did on this Casio Royale or something. That was quite a while ago, and before that there was like nothing. I think.
Yeah. And I remember, you know, when I started reading like, I don't know, 11, 12, 13. I mean, it was like, I almost felt like every other week they were having a value proposition article. Um, So it was definitely a more of a mix of like genuine sort of journalism, whereas now like you get those sprinkled in between like a lot of the different sort of I guess like paid stuff, right?
Yeah.
But I
And
mean,
it's not always paid, right? It's just like influenced, or
just
like
biased.
there
Yes.
are things you can biased is a good word there, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe you don't have a connection with some brand, but maybe you want to have it in the future, or maybe you just don't want to like burn bridges, or
Yeah.
and it's like you know, like the person who reads it, he wants to get like opinions. So what do you think? And it just all positive and
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
this all really happened when they started to sell watches, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the collaborations were one thing, but then once they decided to shift into actually being authorized dealers for watches, um, that's when I think things really started to change. And now they
It's
have so many
uh,
brands, right? Like they even have
yeah,
G-Shocks and then Norcanes, and they're having micro brands now too, which is really bizarre to me because I
yeah,
never saw them sort of, and like they have Seikos now that are like under $1,000. I never really saw them as venturing into that world, but now they're like full blown
yep,
retailer essentially, you know?
yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned kind of a relationship with the shop. So I remember during H10, somebody asked Ben some. I don't remember exact question, but it was a question about like I think biases in the articles. Like, are you biased? So Ben said, you know, our relationships with brands are very clear. Go to our Hodinkee shop and see the brands that we carry. So that was the answer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like almost like a politician at this point. So many relationships that he can't like, you know, he can't break any of them. I was about to say something like, oh, and but you know what's funny though too is they're also a little weird about pricing and stuff in the shop because I remember I saw an article of I think it was the Omega Seamaster or it was some type of I don't know in the comments. I read the comment sections a lot of times just to see what people
Oh
say
yeah,
because people
those are
have a
good.
lot of great
Yeah, those
input,
are
right?
good.
And they're usually pretty unfiltered. And someone was talking about the current gen, the Wave Dial Seamaster Professional Ceramic Dial. And someone was like, wow, like no discount, full retail, blah, blah, blah. And then
Oh,
Ben chimed in the comments actually, and he was like, try walking into any AD these days and getting a discount, right? Or something along those lines, which I mean, I can understand for some brands, but I thought that was like slightly disingenuous when it came to Omega in particular, because it takes like a
yeah,
day of research to realize that you can go on the forums and get an SMPC for, you know, 10-20% off brand new. You literally just go to Watch Recon, type in Seamaster, and you'll see a bunch of brand new inbox, maybe not a bunch, but a few like new inbox or brand new inbox Seamasters that are like
oh,
$4,000, not
yeah.
5,200, right?
Or
So
even these smaller dealers from New Jersey, right? You just like call one or two
exactly.
of them.
Oh yeah,
They're gonna give you lower price, and they're gonna ship it to you, and you're not gonna pay tax.
yeah,
Like, it's
exactly,
like what?
exactly. That's so I was kind of a little perplexed by that because I was like, you know, I can understand some of these, you know, like obviously you're not going to get a Rolex at a discount, right? Or maybe, you know, some more like higher horology brand. But like to say that about Omega, like a lot of the prices that Hodinkee posts in their shop, I'm surprised that people pay
Yeah, yeah.
those amounts, you know, unless it's like a very exclusive watch or hard to get. Like I think I bought the PVD Hamilton off of Hodinkee when it
Mm-hmm,
first came out because they were the exclusive retailer for months
mm-hmm.
before it finally sort of made its way into some of the other places. But yeah, that was, I don't know why I just thought of that, but I thought that was kind of interesting. That kind of goes along the lines of sort of selling out and how, you know, Ben is usually very transparent and honest about stuff. Um, but anyways, that's just sort of a point that I thought about as well.
Yeah.
So,
Um, I also want to mention a little bit Hodinkee Radio, the
hmm
podcast, because I was bitching about it so much.
hmm
They improved. Like they are
mm,
actually really good now.
They take
yeah,
feedback. They take criticism and
hopefully,
feedback.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think they really do.
yeah.
Yeah, I had stopped for a little while, and then it is enjoyable, especially when they sort of, for me, when they segment Hodinkee Radio. So in the
Mm-hmm.
beginning, they'll just do a roundup of like the week, and they'll have like Ben and James on, or like, you know, whoever, and then they'll do
Yep.
like the interview as like
Mm-hmm.
sort of like a quick 30-minute interview or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And they definitely have improved a lot, and I think SJP Stephen Pulver has
Mm-hmm.
you know, he's kind of taken the lead, it seems like, on the Hodinkee podcast, and I think he's been doing a pretty good job of sort of organizing ideas and topics for the podcast and kind of
Yeah.
presenting them
Yeah.
pretty well
Yeah.
recently. So
I'm so glad to see that, because like before that it was kind of like podcast sold out, right? Usually
mm,
they invite some person that often you never heard about. Like it's not a watch person, it's somebody like some like business person who like
yeah.
invested in them or something. And he for I don't know, like 80% of the podcast he talks about his business. And it's like, oh,
Mm.
let me talk about wine.
Oh,
And they
right.
talk about the wine. Like what the hell is this? But this is not happening anymore. This is so awesome. Yeah, so
Yeah,
it's
and when they do
mhm,
have those types of people, they condense those segments, right, to sort of the
mhm.
most interesting stuff, and they chop it up and probably edit it and whatever, and get the most interesting parts, which is great, because there's some podcasts that I have skipped and I probably will not listen to. But some of those people are like relatively interesting, you know, and like with their ties to Hodinkee, and obviously Hodinkee is no longer just a watch, like watch I don't know, brand or whatever you want to call it, but more so like a lifestyle thing too. So I think that's why they try
Mm.
to introduce some of these people that talk about sort of the finer things, right? Like the sommelier
So
that was on, like you said,
so
and some of the other people.
I understand that on like Grey NATO and stuff, but on anyway, it's so
Yeah,
like I was like you. I almost stopped listening to Hodinkee Radio, and now I'm pretty much listening for every episodes.
yeah. I stopped for a long while, and then I've been catching up recently. I mean, it's great too, because they have people like Ed Malon, like recently, right? Like who doesn't want to
Mhm,
listen to that? Like Ed
mhm.
Malon is a visionary when it comes to modern day marketing and watches, and the way he sort of built this brand Moser over the last couple of years. So
Mhm.
it's cool that they still have some people like that. I'm also actually looking at this My Watch story.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Have you seen that?
Sorry, I've
What are your
seen that.
what are your thoughts on that?
Ah, I don't know. Like it's you can see that the quality of videos is not the same as like Hodinke's quality,
Mm,
and like while those are interesting, but I think maybe like I'm surprised more people didn't reach out to them with kind of like more interesting stuff. But that's an interesting stuff. So
maybe they did,
like
and
it's
that's just the ones they selected. You know, I personally,
hopefully.
I haven't watched the videos. I
Uh-huh.
probably won't.
Oh, you
Uh,
should. Yeah, you should. They're
I,
very quick. Yeah.
okay, I'll check them
Hmm.
out then. I'll check
Uh-huh.
them out. Um, but yeah, yeah. I don't know what else to say about that. I'm on their website right now, just kind of looking. You know, I mean, obviously, the whole talking watches thing was like revolutionary. You know,
Yep.
they
Yep.
were the first people to do that with sort of I guess you could say more famous people or like esteemed
Hmm.
collectors, you know, like
Hmm.
John Goldberger and things like that.
Hmm.
And that's incredible content to share with the watch enthusiast community, right? And
Yep.
you see like Waco does a lot of interviews with people now, like and some sort of talking watches segments, and they sort of paved the foundation for other brands to kind of branch off and do their own thing. Like Waco did like a whole Tonk Cintre video with Goldberger just on
Mm.
that. And like,
Hmm.
I don't know if he would have gotten that idea to sort of just do that
Hmm.
without the influence of Hodinkee starting that with like
That
7 years ago
definitely
or
not.
6 years
Yeah.
ago at
Yeah.
this point, right? Um, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's getting more difficult. Oh, you know who's a great Watches by SJX is a pretty fantastic uh,
Hmm.
blog
I'll check
that
it out. Huh?
100%
Hmm.
that is unbiased and like doesn't seem to have like any type of ties with brands.
Hmm.
So I would highly recommend Watches by SJX as like uh, a
Alternative.
non-biased, like straight to the source. And the person that the guy SJX, I think he's based out of Singapore or Hong Kong, somewhere in the Asian Pacific area. Um, he knows watches really well.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Like, he writes about Seikos, and
Everything, everything.
I know the
Yeah,
way you're talking about. Yeah, that's a good, yeah,
from like
that's a
Seiko
good
to
stuff.
Richard Mille to like to
Hmm.
Patek, like everything, and
Hmm.
he knows his stuff and respects all
Hmm.
price ranges and everything. So um,
Yeah.
I think that's I would say if I had to pick like a number one website for just pure, unbiased content, like I would say Watches by SJX is probably my favorite right now from anytime I look stuff up. But yeah, you know, Hodinkee still drops gems every once in a while. Reference Points is a
Yeah.
fantastic series
Fantastic, man.
that they
Yeah,
still
yeah.
do. You know, um,
So. But remember, that they did their reference points on GMTs when GMTs become popular. Right?
yeah, right.
They did. So like nobody cared about GMTs, right? They were selling for like, I don't know, $3,000 or something. But after that, Rolex re-released the GMT, and everybody was like, "Whoa, such a great watch!" And the prices went up. And to reinforce the trend, Hodinkee released that amazing reference points on GMT. But if they would do it before, like if they believed it was a good watch, or like why you don't do it before? Because you just keep reinforcing those trends, and people collect the same stuff, and
Yeah,
anyway.
and they also do stick to, like, for example, Rolex, right? And
That's because that's in trend right now.
you know,
Yeah.
not only that though, I think it's also because when you're doing reference points, they want to find watches that have really long lineage, lots of history, that haven't necessarily changed drastically over the years, right? So there's a lot of nitty gritty fine details in watches, right? Or in Rolex that reference points can really showcase. Like you have two watches that look the exact same, and then you have Eric Wynn saying, "Oh, this one has the flat four or whatever. This variation changed. They changed the text here and there." And I don't. I mean, that's also why I think Rolex is that popular, right? Is because they've pretty much stayed tried and true to the watches
Yeah,
since
but
the 50s and 60s.
that kind of you can say similar things about, for example, Grand Seiko, right? And I'm sure there are similar things about like
That's, I mean,
80s and
I no, I think they should 100%. They haven't done a Royal Oak reference points, which I think would be
yeah,
awesome, right?
yeah.
And I mean, they did obviously the Speedmaster one, which was fantastic.
Yep. I saw that one.
But I think there's a lot of other ones they can do. Like they could easily do a Seamaster, or a Seamaster one,
Yep.
like Seamaster 3. And there's a lot of variations of the Seamaster, obviously, but sort of like the tried and true sports watch, starting with the Seamaster 300 and then going through with the wave dials later on and everything.
If only Omega would pay them to do it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they're not paying them the big bucks yet. Yeah, but I mean, and I think they did a reference points with the Patek Perpetual calendars as well.
Oh, I think yes. It was a long time ago.
That was
a
long. Of course, it was a long time ago, right? When like I was saying, when they were at their best, is when they did it a long time ago. But they're still fantastic videos. But it would be cool to see a lot more. But I think one of the issues is getting all those watches in one place at one time. I think it's probably a lot easier said than done to get like every single variation of a watch together. That's probably maybe part of the reason. But I think in terms of value, like I think reference points is probably one of my favorite segments that they do. Besides talking watches too.
There's talking watches. There are some. There are anyway. There is all like there is four revolutions. Like I absolutely loved Heaton's article about band straps.
It's cool, that
like nobody paid him.
You have to give them credit for giving especially Jack Forster and John. Like Jack Forster did that Spring Bar article Like, you know, it's so like obscure to talk about spring bars and like the origin of spring
Hmm.
bars, but they go ham on it. They go way deep dive
Yeah.
into it. And like John, you said, a lot of those articles that they do are underappreciated. But I think the reason that they don't have those sort of nerdy articles as much is probably because they don't get as many hits, to be honest, unfortunately. Um, but they,
Oh, you think
you
they
know,
don't even get as many hits? That could
yeah,
be.
because I mean,
Yeah, it could be.
like the spring bar article is awesome, but like how many people probably just skim past that,
Man,
right?
I read it like 5 times.
Right. Of course you did, right? But sort of the general audience that Hodinkee has, you know, I'm thinking of somebody like me when I first started reading Hodinkee, and I was still accumulating like a very baseline level knowledge of watches, sort of let's say under the $10,000 price point. Um, there were a lot of fantastic articles that I mentioned, like back in 12 and 13, that I just skimmed over. And I'm going back over the last, couple of years now, going back and reading those and being
Hmm.
like, wow, were incredible articles and gems that
Yeah.
were about like Calatravas and perpetual calendars, right? And like um, that I think you also have to kind of think of the target audience and why they publish some of the articles that they do, especially now, since every click is money, right? It's a cha-ching sound every time.
Yeah.
So it's definitely changed a lot, but they've contributed so much to the watch world and really shaped, like you said, shaped a lot of tastes,
Yeah.
tastemakers, I guess you would call them, for like the vintage world and stuff, which, also kind of sucks because people with money can basically buy whatever they want. So if they see something that's really hot, that's going to be trending 10, 20 years from now, like vintage Rolex, for example, specific references of vintage Rolex, then they're going to buy it. Like for example, like even you look at like old vintage Rolex Milgaus's, right? Like
Oh, yes,
they
yeah.
don't really talk about them, right? They talk sub, GMT, Daytona, and those are the ones
Yeah.
that are expensive. And
Yeah.
if
The
they spotlighted
Milgauss.
some more obscure references, then those
Yeah.
references would probably also blow up.
Yeah.
So, but with that said, they've contributed so much to last decade of kind of watches and the watch community in general. Um,
I just wonder
so
if there is a way to do it differently. Like if there is a way to do business like that, which is not sponsored by the brands that you're supposed to criticize. But yeah, I
I think they're too far gone. Like they've sort of reached the point of no return. You can't.
you're
There,
probably right.
you
Yeah.
know,
Hmm.
like once the money starts flowing in, it's like because I mean there are investors. I'm pretty sure there are investors in Hodinkee now. Like I
Oh
don't know,
yeah.
like 3 or 4 years
Yeah.
ago is when Ben
Yeah.
decided to sort of bring in people. So obviously they have a big say and they don't want to see revenue decrease by or the profit growth reduced by
Yep.
20% because they decide that they want to
Mm.
go more to their roots. Like they can't do that anymore because the investors
Yep.
are going to be like, what the hell are you
Yeah.
doing? I don't care about
Yeah.
the content. I just want to make sure that it's making money, right? So
Yeah.
but with that said, they still have some pretty great articles, but like with them being retailers now, unfortunately, I think those days are kind of gone. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't. I don't know if there's any way they can sort of go back to
No,
the
it's
old
probably gonna
journalistic integrity that they
it's
had.
probably gonna be a different business. And it might be a different medium because Hodinkee is mostly about articles, right? About
Yeah.
somebody like opening the like iPad or laptop and reads text, right? Like probably in the future, like video might be more like they create some videos, but not that much.
Who?
I don't know.
Sorry, who?
No, video. I'm saying
Oh,
video
video,
might
video.
be more like a medium for, or like even like I don't know, VR, something
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that. You know?
But
Yeah.
that's the thing. Like even then, at a certain point, it's like some of the YouTube channels, like the big ones out there,
Yeah,
right,
they're
are
selling out.
they're selling out too, right? There are
Yeah.
some that still like maintain, and I think it's easier to maintain integrity with a YouTube channel rather than a massive blog like this where you're selling ad space, you're selling articles, you're selling so many different things, right? But I mean, you have some big channels like Bruce Williams, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or there's a few different ones out there, right? That still stay completely unbiased and work with dealers and brands, but still deliver a pretty unbiased opinion. But then when you get to like TGV level, like I
Yeah.
mean, I don't watch
Yep,
TGV
yep.
anymore, right? Like when he first started back years ago, I watched his videos at first, and then I completely, I don't know, maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, just completely stopped watching anything he does.
Mm-hmm.
But he was even bought out by like
What
Govberg,
you
right?
want? Govberg, yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And like
Yeah.
I don't really like Teddy Baltazar is a good example. I don't really watch his stuff either. Every once in a while, he has some really cool content that I care about, but like he's sponsored by Bob's Watches too, right? And I don't watch enough of his reviews to know if he is biased based on where the watches are coming from or whatever. But I think he does a pretty good job at maintaining sort of a neutral approach. But
the same thing with Theo and Harris, right? Like they like Christian was supposed to be about vintage watches, right? Now he's slowly moving into this like modern kind of sponsored advertised stuff.
yeah, because ultimately, like he made videos and still makes videos to sell his watches too, right? So his is kind of a little bit different, where he's not really taking as much from other people, but he wants to sell his own stuff, right? So if he gets a watch in and that's not selling, and he's probably going to make a video about it, like a 3 or 4 minute video, so that he can hype it up a little bit. Or I don't really watch him. I don't really watch much YouTube, to be honest, anymore either. But like the Cartier Crash at some auction a few days ago, I think sold for $100,000 or like a little over $100,000. And a couple days later, he made a video about the Crash, right? Because he has one, which is an incredible watch. But obviously, he's trying to ride that hype train and hype his own inventory up so that it sells. So that's a little different, though, right? That's not like selling out. That's just sort of like he's in it for himself.
No.
There,
He
which
has
is
like he has partnerships with Grand Seiko.
Oh, really?
And he made some videos about Grand Seiko.
Oh, and Watches and Wonders? No, not Watches and Wonders. Sorry.
No,
whatever that brand is in the Oculus in World Trade Center. The brand Watches of Switzerland. London Jewelers. London Jewelers.
Yeah, he has partnership with London Jewelers, and he's doing videos how great watches London Jewelers are selling, and
So I mean, I wouldn't call that selling out. I would, he's has partnerships with them, but I still think that he does a pretty good job of not just saying buy this watch from London Jewelers. Like he really showcases them. I actually have, Christian may have some questionable like vintage knowledge, or maybe in the past he had some questionable vintage knowledge and some issues and with selling some pieces, obviously way over market and whatnot. But he definitely creates some killer content. You got to give him that.
That I agree. Yep.
He does have some really great videos, and
that's why I still I'm subscribed to to Christian.
Yeah,
I watch his videos, like not all of his videos, but I watch a lot of his videos.
Yeah. And I like going back now. I have way more of an appreciation for Cartier, and looking back at some of his older videos, seeing that he had that appreciation long ago, that gives me a little bit more respect for him too, because I think Cartier is one of the most underrated brands out there with their history. A lot of people just see them with the Tank Francois that every woman has, in Manhattan, and they that's a whole Cartier is a whole another discussion that we can get into. You know what I mean? I think they're way underrated in terms of some of the stuff that they've done. And their contributions really to watches, they're right up there with Rolex, in my opinion. But that's a topic for another day.
Maybe we'll do another one.
Yeah, exactly.